Welcome to the Zigmund Reichenbach Show, episode number 4. We do have a great one here for you today. As always, we have our great guest, the great, majestic Christian Watson, here with us to have another thrilling discussion about politics, life, philosophy, and in some cases, love and the intersection of all those things. So be braced for an exciting show. If you could go to zigmundreichenbach.com to subscribe to our newsletter to see all the things that we are talking about here today in our show. Also, you can go to patreon.com/Zigmund E. Reichenbach to make a contribution to the show. That would help us expand and reach an even larger audience. The first thing we'll do is we will get right into it here shortly. We'll be talking about term limits and how they are not what people believe that they are. But before I get to that, Christian, how's life going for you, buddy?
It's going good, Zygmunt. I'm happy to be here, especially since I'm more situated now and I have my little setup behind me. And you'll see more and more interesting things happen as time persists. You have these two pictures of these two great philosophers, in my opinion, some two of the greatest natural law thinkers in the history of that tradition. You got the one that everyone knows, John Locke over here, looking majestic as always. And you have a guy that most people don't know, Lord Keynes, Henry Home, was actually a leading figure in the Scottish Enlightenment and actually was David Hume's teacher, although him and Hume disagreed quite a lot on many moral issues. Like he actually attacked Hume on the is-ought problem. So anyway, you can expect to see more of these type of people in my presence as I try to capture that pensiveness, so to speak.
Nice. And if you're watching, go ahead and make sure to look at Christian's Pensive Politics on his YouTube channel. That's how I knew that he would be perfect for this show as somebody who also studies philosophy. In fact, I still have my master's degree on the wall, although it may not be worth the paper it's printed on, but hey, at least it's a credential, right? Anyhow, back to get started on our conversation, the call for term limits. So I had written on the article last Monday regarding the matter of term limits, saying cruising towards political disaster or something of that nature. It was actually, I reposted that from something that I'd written some time ago when Ron DeSantis, back when he was in Congress, and Ted Cruz were talking about term limits. And really, what I'm trying to point out is that term limits is not what people are making it seem. In fact, in many cases, politicians have a incentive to lie about the nature of term limits, because once they get termed out, as that article highlights, they're more likely to make even more money than what they would ordinarily. Christian, what are your thoughts on term limits, and do you think that they are the political panacea that so many people are looking for, or do you think that there could indeed be something else going on behind the scenes?
Term limits are the moral equivalent of pointing at someone who's robbing a house and saying, if that person hadn't been allowed to rob houses for so long, they wouldn't be robbing that house. It is a poor substitute for A, the responsibility of the voter, and B, the necessity of politicians being virtuous. The entire basis for term limits in the popular conception is that if we have the newer people, we get better things in terms of our politics. And that idea presumes that a lot of the bad ideas in politics don't come from a certain set of values or principles that transcend, one's time in office, but they come by virtue of the fact that someone has been in office for 50 years. So by this idea, someone like Bob Dole, I think, who recently either retired or passed away, I cannot remember, but he was like one of the longest serving congresspeople. Someone like Bob Dole would be considered, if he had any bad ideas, they'd be considered to be bad because he's been in office so long, not because he actually believes in the tenets of those ideas. And this is the problem. You don't get good ideas and good values by simply substituting the face behind them. You get good ideas and good values by getting people who embrace good ideas and good values, and that is a value. That is a quality that is independent of one's time in office. Now, there is some merit to the idea that having a longer time in Washington can make one more susceptible to certain things that are not righteous. There is merit to the idea that if someone has been in Washington, let's say the average the term for a senator in the United States is 6 years. Excuse me. For a representative, it is 2 years. One could say that a senator who has been in office for 4 terms, you do the math, is more susceptible and comfortable with lobbyists and cozying up special interest than a junior senator who has been in term like one term.
Well,
One could make that argument.
let's talk about that for a minute. I think it's particularly interesting.
I was gonna
go ahead.
Yeah. Go.
No, I just wanted to mention I think it's particularly interesting to talk about term limits in the context of senators versus representatives, because
Sure. Yeah.
it appears as if my reading of the Federalist is correct, then senators aren't supposed to be term limited for the very reason that their extended wisdom and greater experience is going to be in a better position, certainly not a perfect position, to correct the popular errors of the House. And therefore, it's incumbent and in some ways good that those people do seek out those longer terms. But to respond to what it is that you mentioned, I think it's interesting. It may be the opposite of what it is that people believe. So take California, for example. The state of California, they do have term limits in both the House and their Senate, if I'm not mistaken. And in that case, it sort of creates a revolving door where somebody leaves state government and then they become a lobbyist or something else, and then they go back into a different chamber, and then they run for something else, and then they get appointed federally. And in that case, really, because there is so much forced turnover, you actually have more people listening to lobbyists because they don't know what else to listen to, because they haven't dedicated themselves to the craft or profession, and moreover, they just haven't been able to track the legislation. You can't track bills as an individual if you're not in there long enough to track the bills or to have that institutional memory, right? To know what bills are going through and which bills are not. And so I think in those cases you actually have more dependency on lobbyists. But moreover, I don't think it's the case that lobbyists are fundamentally bad. Technically, in my professional life, I'm registered as a lobbyist. I'm just helping to articulate the views that people feel but don't have the time, capability, or interest to express, right?
Sure. Yeah, there's multiple things there in that response. So one of the first things you mentioned is the relationship between staying in office, institutional knowledge, and the wisdom that proceeds from the latter, from the former, staying in office for a long time. I think that ideally that's a brilliant idea, and I'm sure the founders had the exact same idea, but unfortunately, it's not how it manifests in reality. Most senators and representatives in the House don't possess institutional knowledge at that level, or if they do, they possess knowledge of how to use the institution to further their ends. Very few senators throughout the history of the Congress have actually possessed true institutional knowledge for the sake of understanding the body in which they serve. One of the last ones who one could truly say he did, and you probably already know who I'm going to say. He was a former senator from West Virginia who has now passed, a former Ku Klux Klan member. I can't remember his name for the life of me, but you know what I'm talking about. He possessed Robert Byrd, Senator Byrd. Senator Byrd possessed true institutional knowledge. He could go back and recite debates that happened before in the 1900s. He could go back and articulate the natural law and Enlightenment roots of the American Republic and show how that transition into congressional debates. That man had true institutional knowledge. I think he got it by wanting it. But there are a lot of folks, like I say, Mitch McConnell, who know how to manipulate the institution, or Chuck Schumer, or Nancy Pelosi, who have been there for a long time, but don't really care about all of that. They care about manipulation. So I don't necessarily think there's a causal relationship between staying in one place for a long time and appreciating that place. Because institutional knowledge is, in fact, an appreciation of that place. That's one thing I would say. And if regardless of how long you've been in office, and this is your second claim, if you're going to be more susceptible to a lobbyist just because you haven't been in office for a long time, then being in office for a long time was never your problem. Gullibility is your problem. Politicians should have enough of a stalwart. Well, they don't. Most of them do not. You know this, having worked with them. Politicians should have a stalwart will and a desire to learn what they're going to be voting on and the issues they're going to be championing, regardless of how long they've been in office. And that doesn't come from being in one place for a long time necessarily. It can, but I think it comes from a studied appreciation of the body they're in, which goes back to my initial point.
No, but it's the case that when you're automatically term limited out, the incentives change such that not only do they change that it disallows for you to continue to serve in order to gain the knowledge of which bills are useful and which ones aren't, but also it changes your incentive such that you just want to listen to the lobbyist to get things done that they want so you can be remembered in your brief time and then go ahead and move to a higher office. But I think generally we're on the same page here, that term limits really are not what it is that people are claiming that it is indeed is. It's not a solution. Part of this comes from Newt Gingrich's contract with America, which is part of a greater and perhaps clever ploy to take back the House. And that's good that the House was indeed taken back after decades of Democrat control. We've seen unlimited entitlements, the vast outgrowth of the entitlement state. And so that was on whole a not good thing. But term limits was just part of that ploy to cast aspersion on a political enemy, at that point Democrats, for political gain. I don't think it was serious. And I think that there are scholarly and learned reasons to oppose it. There's a book out there, and I'll have to send it to the audience or post about it, that really highlights the problem with term limits in more detail than what I can. I guess I'll just end with that California has term limits, and if you're advocating for term limits, you're advocating for more places to be like California, which I think by most standard measures is considered dysfunctional, socialist, partisan. And I do think that term limits has a large role in that, because when people leave, they're not inclined to build the relationships that would be strong enough to overcome the partisan pressure that's put on them by lobbying groups and by big donors. So
Now, what if the relationships those people build up, though, while they're in the body, are actually centered around appeasing the lobbyists, or appeasing the party whip, or appeasing both? Because a lot of legislative relationships are built around those things, and that's the thing here. I agree with you. We agree on term limits, on principle, but I'm not sure we are agreeing on the effects thereof of term limits. Because I want to believe that if you have people in an institution for a long enough time, as you're saying, they will be more immune to outside pressure, or more immune to the wrong kind of decision making we've been seeing for a very long while in congressional bodies around the country than they would if they had term limits. I want to believe that, but the evidence, Zygmunt, does not pan out. So how do you square the two?
Yeah, so I mean, I do think the evidence pans out. There's a book written on the subject that I don't think many people have thoughtfully considered. I think people are just going on the inflammatory rhetoric and not actually consulting a thorough scholarly study. And it's my fault for not having that with me. But I do think that is the case, that the facts is that things are more partisan, it's more dysfunctional, and it does not work. And that's not only anecdotal evidence through the people who served in these state houses that do have them in this book that I'm mentioning to you, but that's just evidenced by how California operates, and to some degree common sense. We all know that we have friends who are partisan, but they're not going to be inclined to be an enemy towards us directly because we're friends with them. Well, if you can't build that relationship because people are being term limited out, then it does indeed follow that these people are going to be more inclined to be partisan. So I'm saying that.
Okay, well,
go ahead.
Yeah, I have not read this book. I will admit that. Although I don't think that folks need to read a particular academic work to have a coherent opinion on something. So I have not read this book.
I'm not saying that, just to be clear.
Yeah. Look, I look forward to reading it. But okay, here's my question: Does this book is this book saying that okay, there's this sort of absence of relationships when term limits are created that makes one more susceptible to political pressure? Okay, all right, let's set that. Does this same pressure not exist in the presence of no term limits? Because it would seem that it does if you look at Congress. That's
Well,
my question.
yeah. So some of what you're saying also does make sense too, and I get where you're coming from. Where because the Democrat Party has become a more urban centric party, that there's a greater incentive for partisanship and the disregard of whatever folks in the other party, and vice versa are thinking. I will say anecdotally in the state level, in Pennsylvania, there is a good enough deal of bipartisanship on certain issues that aren't well covered, because because then that would stop people from being able to fundraise off them, right? People
Yeah,
wouldn't be
yeah.
able to fundraise off the lack of criminal justice reform if
Mm.
people knew that people are working on real sensible criminal justice reforms.
That
But the
makes
book
sense. That
here,
makes sense.
the
Yeah.
the book here is term limits and the dismantling of state legislative professionalism. And I know that seems thick, and I'm not saying it like I have some kind of elite knowledge, or that even people have to read that to have a good point of view. I'm saying that the conversation has been so skewed and so
Mm-hmm.
one-sided about the need for it, because people have misaddressed the root of the political problems, then this would help provide some additional clarity with the kind of
Makes sense.
anecdotes that I'm talking about, with people who actually did serve. So that's an interesting subject, and I think, Christian, we could probably do a whole show on that sometime, and I would actually be interested in doing
Me
it.
too. Me too.
I sent over the
Me too.
the link for you, so anybody can read that, and I'll go ahead and put that in our chat here, so that way anybody can look at it. Susan asked, "Do I think?" Well, not all the time, but sometimes I try to. That's part of the reason why we're having that discussion. Maybe you meant
It's
to ask
funny.
a more full question, and I hope to hear from you soon. So, our next article then that we discussed was the politicization of love, and to some degree, what I had written was more or less a complaint about how the left, particularly socialists, have politicized this idea of love for political gain. And so there I say that the idea, the politicization of love, began with utopian socialist. And so this part here, this next part is going to come out as an attack. Having no money, no understanding of political theory, no artistic or literary talent, and no position in society, socialists appeal to what literal they did have to gain influence: their petty emotions. Accordingly, socialists argued for free love because the traditional means of earning love through the presentation of an attractive skill or trait eluded them. And so they were desperately reduced to giving and receiving free love, mostly to each other. And so that alludes to the socialist idea, and we can talk more about this, about what they're actually calling love. They're using it as a euphemism for sexual activity is what they're using that for, free love. And I don't think that really connotes the basis of love, but also, as I described in this article, they were using that idea to gain adherence to their social movement. And in Barack Obama's case, because he always seemed like he was for love, he used this idea that I'm such a loving figure, you guys will never know when I bomb people in Syria. Okay. Hey, you guys love me, and I'm all about peace. Now I'm going to drop some peace bombs, some love bombs in the Middle East. And I think anybody
Yeah.
ought to be concerned that they are being manipulated through love to support politicians that want to bomb people. I don't know
Yeah,
how else to
yeah,
make that more clear, but that seems problematic, right, Christian?
yeah. You mentioned Barack Obama, and that's very interesting because Barack Obama did run on peace. He did run on particularly withdrawing us from the wars that Bush Jr. had gotten us into, or had gotten us into, had further entrenched us, and he ran on that. In fact, I'm sure you'll remember that he said that he'll get to the first thing he does when he gets in office would be to withdraw Americans from the war. I think it's either Afghanistan or Iraq, and lo and behold, one of the first things he does in office is drop drone bombs on villages that have children in them. It's interesting, and it's and he also and they also awarded him the Nobel Peace Prize too. It's interesting how this sort of dual consciousness, right, of these people, right? It's very interesting to see it. But yeah, I also think the idea of free love is quite interesting as well, because love, if you think about what it actually is, maybe we can get a little bit more esoteric here.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way it can be free in any way, shape, or form. Even the genesis of love, having this sort of immense emotional affectation towards someone, requires an expulsion of energy from you. And as we understand, Zygmunt, as philosophers, we understand that if we consider the nature of human beings are finite creatures. In anything we do, any kind of energy we use, whether it's energy that goes ahead to read a book like this one, whether it's energy that goes ahead to read an article, energy that goes ahead to go exercise, no matter what it is, you're going to have an expulsion of potential. So the more you devote your attention to one thing, the less you have to devote it to other things. Love happens to be a very big time suck if it's actually real, because you have the courting process, then you get dating, you have that process, and relationships take time and they take work. So just by the very nature of the activity, it's not free because it costs our energy. But the problem is, these folks have bastardized, as you mentioned, what love means, what it takes to have love.
They've
But
also socialized the idea in theory to think that it's something that you can give away to anybody. But
and
just
it's
think
not.
of kind of how repulsive that may be, to just going up to anybody and giving them a smooch, giving a stranger a kiss on the lips and say,
Yeah.
"Hey, whoa,
Uh,
whoa, whoa, whoa!
uh,
I'm just giving you
well,
free love here."
in the Me Too age, that might be a little bit dangerous. That might be a little bit dangerous. That Bill Cosby stuff, right? No, 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 no. We can't say that. We can't say that. We can't say that.
but but
No.
the idea in and of itself is just fundamentally absurd. And actually, when we take time to think about it, we realize that the greatest tributes to love are the very opposite of free. Right.
Yeah.
That's why Greek tragedy is so inspiring, particularly the
Mm-hmm.
Odyssey, where a man is exiled
Mm-hmm.
from his family for 20 years, and they're considering just abandoning him. People are taking advantage of his wife. His son is
Suitors,
in
yeah.
somewhat disarray and could certainly use his guidance. But after 20 years, he turns down becoming an immortal. Okay, he could have become, if not a god himself, very close to it. And he chose to sacrifice that for the love of his family and
Yeah.
son
Yep.
and kingdom and the
Absolutely.
people that he served. And so with that being such a great tribute to love, it's because of the individual sacrifice, right?
And yeah, and the wife as well. I mean, I forgot who Odysseus's wife was.
Yep.
I mean, it's been a long time since I read the Odyssey, but
Yep.
his wife as well, who was being plagued by the suitors, who didn't have faith that her husband was going to return. I mean, she had to hold on to some things as well. She had to hold on to a little bit of faith. She had to sacrifice a lot
That's
too.
right.
Those people were up in her house trying to dictate things to her, trying to constantly take Odysseus's place. And when he finally returned, will correct me if I'm wrong. I think he was victorious over the suitors. I think he was, right.
Yeah,
Odysseus.
both. So he was
Athena helped him, I
successful
think.
because of
Yeah,
the
Athena helped him.
goddess Athena, who
Yeah,
helped
yeah,
to
Athena
guide
helped
him
him. Yeah,
back to his
yeah,
home. And when he got
yeah,
back, he murdered every single one of the suitors that tried to
yeah.
get with his wife and
Yep.
defeated all the people that were trying to take advantage. And it's such a
And that's
glorious
not free
thing.
either. That's not free either.
Well,
That sure as hell's not free.
in the free love movement, in the free love version of that, he would have came back describing his oppression and would have voluntarily surrendered his kingdom to these other people who he felt guilty and sad about, and they would have had a psychedelic experience. Wow. Probably ultimately at the end of the day, their kingdom getting ravaged by barbaric outsiders who indeed don't believe that things are free. Right.
Well, and so now I do want to throw a bone to this idea of I want to establish some kind of understanding,
Sure.
because we're talking about love in its proper sense, in terms of its proper, what it actually means in its romantic sense. But there's also different gradations of love, you would say, right? Right. There's a love I have for my friends, love I have for my partner, love I have for all kind of my family.
Mm.
And if we're going to accept this sort of hierarchy of love, then my question becomes, is it possible to utilize free love on any position in the hierarchy, or is it just universally condemnable?
Well, I think maybe if you take that position charitably, you can say that you can be kind to somebody, but love in and of itself is fundamentally exclusive, and as it goes up, we'll say a hierarchy for a lack of better term.
Yeah.
As it becomes more intense and involved, then that gradually becomes more exclusive.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Right. I can love 3 friends or 4 friends in a similar way, but if I love my mother in that same way, do I really love her the way I should, or something like that? You know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah, and that way it's sort of a confusion, and that really
Right.
highlights the corruption of politicizing this idea of love and making it seem like, well, if you vote for my party, that means you love people.
Yeah.
Well,
Yep.
but by definition, love isn't a party activity. Okay,
No, it's
then
not.
that might be a nighttime fun time, but that's not love. And anybody who has any appreciation or just even sense of sacrifice can't call cheap and dirty nighttime relations love. Okay, that's not,
They sure aren't.
it's and it's such a, it gets to be kind of pathetic. And I don't think anybody, if there had been better theorizing in the 60s about politics and philosophy and all things meaningful, they would have said, listen, this is madness. You can't have free love, just fundamentally. So yeah,
Agreed.
it's important to note that's been politicized and weaponized, just so that way people can win elections.
And it
Yeah.
would be interesting, maybe we can all come back and revisit free love again, because I'm sure there are some reading resources on free love that explain, further explain the psychology of the position. And it'd be interesting to delve into those tenets as well, because I think it's basically, free love was the basis for the revolution in the 60s, which are responsible for so much of the revolution, so much of the ideologies that are permeating the political consciousness today.
Well, right. Yeah, we can certainly revisit that, but more or less, when what they meant by the idea was bacchanalia.
Yeah.
Unofficial parties have lust and drinking. But that's not
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
love. And
yeah.
actually, if they themselves would have had better foresight or a better understanding, they would have been able to make that connection too.
Well, actually, this is an interesting question. This is an interesting question that I have for you, Zigmund.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that love is a natural concept, as I mentioned. I think that it's as any human expression is, right? And there are certain chemicals in our body associated with love.
Yep.
The release of was it dopamine or something like that?
Yep.
When you but those chemicals are also associated with things like infatuation as well. And so the question becomes, how do you think over history humans have been able to differentiate the kind of feeling they have when they're infatuated and the kind of feeling they have when they're in love? Because depending on the intensity of the relationship, they both can feel pretty similar. Now, someone who believes in scientism would say that it's all just chemicals and there's no differentiation. I fundamentally reject that claim in every way, shape, or form. I assume you do as well. So how would one arrive at the distinction between the two?
Well, I think probably infatuation is like the primal inducement of the chemicals that are partly associated with love. And that's a biological thing that when you're in quote unquote the heat of it, you wouldn't be able to distinguish. But if more people had a more sensible understanding of love, that it requires both sacrifice and attachment to an individual, that they would be able to better understand that. Now, here's why I would really theorize why something like that was so important in history, because the human in and of itself is at such a natural disadvantage because of how long it takes to bring a child to bear. That 9 months means that you're vulnerable, fundamentally vulnerable, and reliant on somebody else for that entire um yeah, great, for that entire experience. And so therefore it's used to bond men and women together for the production and safety and security of their children,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
I think that's the
Yeah.
natural explanation. Not that you got to go here at 5. So we got 3 more topics, and sorry
Let's
guys
go for it.
to cut
Let's go for
you
it.
short. We will make sure next time that we get started in a more timely fashion. The internet went out and it seemed like the walls were falling in, but we will definitely
Fine.
get this straightened out. So we got 3 topics here, Christian, and you can
Let's go
pick
for it.
which ones we discuss in our remaining time. We
Let's go for
have the relation, I call it the Trump litmus test, between testing whether or not people have greater attachment to the makings of monarchy versus our constitutional republic. We have the story of American bureaucracy, or a shortened version of it, about how in the 1920s progressives through Hegel thought that they could reach objective policy conclusions using these big government agencies, which with the advent of the CDC and their mandatory mask now seems demonstrably wrong. And then a progress then and now, where I highlight that during the progressive era, there was actually progress made, where back when we were living in a service, or forgive me, a primarily labor-based economy, a agricultural economy, unions served to protect the middle class from exploitation. Women got the right to vote, and the vast public schooling was used to help rural areas have the resources to have competent schools, and how over time those ideas were made extreme and still called progress to result in the regressive decades, but we're coming out in the end of now. So those are our 3 topics. Christian, you can go ahead and pick the one that.
Let's do the story of progress, and the monarchy question is very interesting. I didn't consider it, but it's very interesting. So let's do those 2.
Okay, great. So we will start off with the Trump litmus test. What I was saying was that the people's relationship to former President Trump served as a litmus test to the American people's fidelity to the Constitution, one that revealed a fault line in our system of representative government. The problem is this: the American people, through perhaps no fault of their own, love presidents more than their representatives, and hence love the makings of monarchy more than our constitutional republic. Okay, so this is a contradiction that either has to be addressed, or it doesn't have to be addressed, and people can love the makings of monarchy over our republic. Have you noticed that trend, Christian, that people love and revere our presidents more than the people who are supposed to represent them? And do you think that that's problematic, or that it's just maybe a fad, or it's good and people are just confused, or what's going on there?
Fad. I wish it was a fad. Oh, everything inside of me would be so happy and delighted if the love of presidents and the idolatry thereof was a fad. It's not a fad. In fact, and this idolatry extends beyond presidents. It does extend to representatives, not as much, but it does. It also extends to historical historical events and historical figures. I was in DC a few weeks ago, and for business for like a day or so. I had to go do something, and I walked down the mall. You know about the mall, Zigmund. I walked from the Lincoln Memorial to the World War II Memorial to almost to the African American History Museum. By that time, I got tired. It's a long walk. I thought I would be able to walk to the Capitol. I couldn't do it. It was a long walk, but I did. I got like a good 40 minutes in, going all the way down, and I'm thinking to myself, Christian, look at what's around you. These are shrines. These are shrines which romanticize certain people in certain events in a manner that eliminates their flaws and paints them in almost a divine light by doing so. That huge statue of Lincoln sitting on that chair, which looks like a throne, is almost like you would see of a divine figure. And you have those quotes emblazoned on the side of the World War II Museum from like FDR. I think one of the quotes of FDR is like, well, people got into action when we began our war effort. You liar. The government nationalized the economy and basically forced businesses to produce tanks and war machines at the threat of punishment. People didn't. Yeah, no, it was, of course there was high public support for the war, but the mandates came first, that came second. Right. And of course, when you have an American homeland getting attacked by the Japanese, you're going to have public morale on your side. Yeah, I understand that. Just like there was public morale on the side of the quote unquote war on terror until that went to pot. So it paints things in a way that romanticizes them. And this is a general problem in American society that we have to confront, or else we're going to go down the path of being non-thinking, non-rational zealots. And that's not what our founders wanted.
Correct.
That's not what the American experiment.
Consider what indeed Hamilton did want. Hamilton argued that the essential relationship the members of the House of Representatives would have with their constituents. Hamilton says, it is essential to liberty that the government in general should have a common interest with the people. So it is particularly essential that the branch of it under consideration, i.e. the House of Representatives, should have an immediate dependence on and intimate sympathy with the people. Well, it does not appear, as I think Hamilton and others would agree, that you can have that kind of attachment between both representatives and a president. One presumably has to supersede the other, right? And so it's problematic because not only did Hamilton assume that, and Hamilton in the Federalist is describing the very nature of what a republic is, right? That's the handbook, whereas our Constitution is the rules of the game. Okay, so the Federalist is the game, the Constitution is the rules. Now, most people aren't familiar with the game, the Federalist, but they like to point to its alleged rules, which I don't know how you can have rules of a game if you don't know what the game is that you're playing, but so it goes for most people. But Hamilton says state legislators who will always be not only vigilant but suspicious and jealous guardians of the rights of the citizens against encroachments from the federal government will constantly have their attention awake to the conduct of the national rulers and will be ready enough, if anything improper appears, to sound the alarm to the people, and not only to be the voice, but if necessary, the arm of their discontent. Now, by all means, the president is a national figure. Yeah. Okay. The state legislators have to step up and say, listen, we respect what it is that you're doing, but you can't come around and start kind of undermining the proper relationship that our constituents have to their government. You can't go around and have people worshiping presidents as if they're the second coming, and that's incumbent on state legislators. That's what Hamilton says directly from Hamilton, from the guy who helped theorize, essentially invent a republic, says that. And instead, there's a lot of people who know better, and don't say otherwise, but that seems to be a problem, right, Christian? That we have these figures in the national government and the administrative state parading around that the administrative state's invisible, so I guess people don't have any affection towards that. But we have a president, and our state legislators are not kind of separating that relationship. Shouldn't that be a nonpartisan thing, the proper role of government?
Yes, I think so. And I think that quote from Hamilton is brilliant because look, and I'll be honest with you, I haven't really, I've, you'll think this is funny. Young scholars like me, I do consider myself a scholar of some degree.
Yep.
Not that young scholars like me who have our ideologies or in or a certain ideological place oftentimes suffer from confirmation bias. And I definitely suffer from confirmation bias about Hamilton. I thought since he was a champion of central banking, he had absolutely nothing beneficial to say about the American experiment. I have realized that is not true. I have realized that even people who I disagree with on a major issue have a lot to say and a lot that can teach me. So I didn't know he said that. And I think he's absolutely right about that. State legislators are certainly more closer and more accountable about them for that fact than presidents are. But there have been some people throughout history that have abused that fact to great extent, like Huey Long. I'm sure you know. I'm sure you're familiar with him. He abused the fact that he was closer to the people to basically take over Louisiana and set up a despotism. So I think that we have to be careful about idolatry in all areas, especially the idolatry that is closest. Especially the idolatry that is closest to us, because that's the idolatry that can actually hurt us the most. Going to the mall and seeing the shrines erected to different different events and different figures is disturbing. But going to your local state house and thinking that your state legislature is some sort of god because he agrees with you on a set of issues, that's lethal.
Yeah, I think that's true, Christian. So I guess we spent most of our time discussing that. We will get to the other subjects, maybe the last one, the story of American bureaucracy. And if you guys want to follow along, you can go to zigmundreichenbach.com. That'll take you to the Substack in which you can look at that in further detail. Next week, what we will do is we will be releasing the newsletter on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I'll try to use that time to see if I can get some other information or another article in a different publication or outlet, just so that way we can continue to expand and grow the community that I know certainly most cares about these issues. And it was so interesting to hear you say that, Christian, that some people have automatically written off Alexander Hamilton as the enemy of liberty because he mentions central banking. And I think that point of view, well, there's probably some truth to it to some degree, but he was indeed a supporter of localism first. That's why he argued so forcefully that the Senate should be elected by the states, which is what I believe, because you destroy the purpose of having this elite house or deliberative body that's supposed to correct the house when you allow them to campaign the same way that somebody from the House of Representatives would. You basically turn it into a longer term representative, and I think that's part of the problem. I think before anybody goes along the lines of term limits, let's make sure that the states have their sovereignty back by having somebody that represents their interest by getting rid of the 17th. So that's indeed all we have today. We will make sure to get back at it for I finally corrected the problem that stopped all this good stuff from coming up on the screen, all this fancy Wizard of Oz razzmatazz here. But we will make sure to be more punctual about that 4 o'clock time. In the meantime, we look forward to seeing y'all again. Review our stuff at zigmundreichenbach.com. Also, make sure to check out Christian's Pensive Politics right there on YouTube. Thanks again.